The spring sun beat down mercilessly on Mabel Lockhart's back as she hurried along the dusty road toward the white steeple that rose above Palisade, Colorado. Her calloused fingers clutched at the tier in her only Sunday dress, a faded blue cotton garment that had seen better days long before she'd inherited it from her late mother. The year was 1882, and life in the mining town had grown increasingly difficult since her father's passing 3 months prior, leaving her alone to manage their small homestead at the tender age of 20. "Please hold together," she whispered to the fraying seam that had split that morning when she'd hitched her wagon. The small rip had grown with each step of her journey into town, now exposing a triangle of her worn petticoat beneath. Mabel had considered turning back, but Sunday service was her only respite from the crushing loneliness of her daily existence, and she desperately needed the comfort of prayer, even if the townsfolk's judgment would surely follow. As she approached the white clapboard church, Mabel's heart sank. The congregation had already gathered on the steps, the women in their fine dresses and men in pressed suits, a stark contrast to her disheveled appearance. She slowed her pace, contemplating retreat, when Mrs. Harriet Pembroke, the banker's wife, spotted her. "Why, if it isn't Miss Lockhart," Harriet announced loudly enough for those nearby to turn. "I see you've decided that the Lord's house requires no particular effort in appearance." Heat crawled up Mabel's neck as several women tittered behind gloved hands. Clutching her Bible tighter, she lifted her chin, determined not to show how deeply the barb had struck. "Good morning, Mrs. Pembroke," she replied evenly. "The Lord sees beyond our garments, does he not? Perhaps, but we needn't subject the entire congregation to such—" Harriet's eyes flicked pointedly to the tier. "Distractions." The church bell rang, saving Mabel from having to respond. As the congregation began filing in, she lingered behind, allowing space between herself and the others. Perhaps she could slip into the last pew unnoticed. Mabel was the final person to enter the church, her footsteps echoing in the sudden silence as everyone had already taken their seats. She felt dozens of eyes tracking her movement as she made her way toward the back, the tear in her dress seeming to widen with each step. "Look at that disgraceful display," someone whispered just loudly enough to be heard. "Her poor father would be mortified," another voice added. Mabel's vision blurred with unshed tears as she reached for the back pew. Before she could sit, a hand caught her elbow. Startled, she looked up into the face of a man she'd seen around town but never spoken to: Wyatt Walker, a rancher who'd moved to Palisade the previous year. His reputation preceded him, hardworking, fair, but intensely private. His blue eyes held no mockery, only a quiet understanding that made her breath catch. "Miss Lockhart," he said, his voice low, but carrying just enough for those nearest to hear. "Would you care to join me? I prefer the back pew myself." His eyes swept meaningfully over the congregation before returning to hers. "Then we'll sit in back together." Without waiting for her response, he guided her to the seat he'd been occupying, positioning himself between her and the judgmental stares. Mabel felt the weight of the congregation's attention shift from her torn dress to this unexpected alliance. Throughout the service, Mabel was acutely aware of Wyatt's presence beside her. He sat tall and straight, his weathered Bible open on his lap, his attention seemingly focused on Reverend Miller's sermon about charity and kindness. She couldn't help but notice the contrast between his words and the treatment she'd received from those who now sat with bowed heads, supposedly in prayer. When the final hymn concluded and the congregation began to disperse, Wyatt remained seated, a silent barrier between Mabel and those who might approach with further judgment. Only when most had cleared out did he turn to her. "I hope I didn't overstep, Miss Lockhart," he said, his voice carrying a slight rasp that suggested he didn't use it often. "Not at all, Mr. Walker. I appreciate your kindness," Mabel replied, surprised at the steadiness in her own voice. "Though I fear you may have invited unwanted gossip upon yourself." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I've never much cared for the opinion of those who measure worth by appearance." As they stepped outside into the sunshine, Mabel could feel the stares and whispers following them. Wyatt seemed oblivious, or perhaps simply unmoved by them. "May I walk you to your wagon?" he asked, his hat already in his hands. "Thank you, but I walk today. My mare is—" Mabel hesitated. unwilling to admit that she'd had to sell her last horse to pay her father's doctor bills. Understanding flickered in Wyatt's eyes. "Then, allow me to offer you a ride home. My wagon's just there." He nodded toward a well-maintained buckboard, hitched to two healthy-looking bays. Mabel hesitated, weighing propriety against practicality. The walk home was long, and the tear in her dress would only worsen. "That's very kind, Mr. Walker." As he helped her into the wagon, his hand steady and warm beneath hers, Mabel caught sight of Harriet Pembroke watching from the church steps, her expression a mixture of shock and disapproval. For once, Mabel found she didn't care. The ride to Mabel's homestead passed in comfortable silence at first, the creaking of the wagon wheels and the steady clop of hooves the only sounds between them. Mabel used the time to study her unexpected champion from the corner of her eye. Wyatt Walker was not what one would call handsome. In the traditional sense, his features were too sharp, his skin too weathered by sun and wind, but there was something compelling in the quiet strength he exuded. "I want to thank you again," she finally said, as they turned onto the narrow trail that led to her property. "Not many would have done what you did." Wyatt adjusted the reins in his calloused hands. "What I did was nothing special, Miss Lockhart, just basic decency." "Decency seems in short supply these days," Mabel replied, her gaze drifting to the distant mountains. "Your father was Joseph Lockhart, wasn't he?" Wyatt asked, changing the subject. "I met him once when I first arrived in Palisade. He spoke highly of you." A lump formed in Mabel's throat. "Yes, he passed 3 months ago." "I heard. My condolences." Wyatt's words were simple, but sincere. "He was a good man." "The best," Mabel agreed. "Though he left me with more debts than assets, I'm afraid." She hadn't meant to share that private detail, and immediately regretted it. But Wyatt merely nodded, as if he understood perfectly the struggle of trying to keep one's head above water in this unforgiving land. As they approached her homestead, a modest cabin with a small barn and corral, Mabel felt a flush of shame at its dilapidated state. The roof needed patching, the corral fence was missing several slats, and the once productive garden was now overrun with weeds. Wyatt brought the wagon to a stop and jumped down, coming around to help her descend. His eyes scanned the property, not with judgment but with assessment. "Looks like you could use a hand with some repairs," he said matter-of-factly. "I manage," Mabel responded, perhaps too quickly. "But thank you for the offer?" Wyatt nodded, respecting her pride. "Well, if you change your mind—" He left the sentence unfinished, the offer hanging in the air between them. An awkward silence followed, neither quite knowing how to proceed. Finally, Mabel gestured toward the cabin. "Would you care for some coffee? It's the least I can offer after your kindness." Something like surprise flickered across Wyatt's features before he schooled them back to neutral. "That would be welcome, thank you." Inside the cabin, Mabel busied herself with the coffee, grateful for something to do with her hands. The interior was simple but clean, with touches of her mother's influence still visible in the hand-stitched curtains and the carefully preserved china cups she now retrieved from a shelf. "Sugar?" she asked, setting the cups on the rough-hewn table where Wyatt sat, looking too large for the modest furniture. "No, thank you. Black is fine." He accepted the cup, his fingers brushing hers for a brief moment. Mabel sat across from him, suddenly aware of how long it had been since she'd entertained a visitor. "I hope you don't think me too forward, Mr. Walker, but may I ask what brought you to Palisade? You're not originally from these parts, are you?" Wyatt took a sip of his coffee before answering. "No, madam. I came from Montana. Spent most of my life moving cattle across the territory. Decided it was time to put down some roots." His eyes met hers. "And please, call me Wyatt. Mr. Walker makes me feel like I'm in trouble with a schoolmarm." A small laugh escaped Mabel, surprising them both. "Very well, Wyatt, and I'm Mabel." "Mabel," he repeated, as if testing the sound of it. "It suits you." They talked for nearly an hour, the conversation flowing more easily than Mabel would have expected. Wyatt spoke of his small ranch on the outskirts of town, of the herd of cattle he was slowly building, and of his hopes to expand one day. Mabel found herself sharing her own struggles, the difficulty of maintaining the homestead alone, the mounting debts, the cold shoulders from townsfolk who had once been friendly when her father was alive. They think a woman has no business trying to run a homestead alone, she admitted. They're waiting for me to fail so they can buy the land cheap. Are you considering selling? Wyatt asked, his tone neutral. Mabel shook her head firmly. This was my father's dream, and my mother's. I can't just give it up. She glanced around the cabin that held so many memories. But I won't lie, it's getting harder each day. Wyatt set down his empty cup. What do you need most urgently? The directness of the question caught her off guard. I couldn't possibly. I'm not offering charity, Mabel, Wyatt clarified, seeming to sense her hesitation. I'm offering a trade. I'm handy with repairs, and I've got livestock experience. Maybe we could work something out. Mabel considered him for a long moment. Pride warred with practicality in her mind. The barn roof needs patching before the summer rains, she finally admitted. And the irrigation ditch to the fields has collapsed in several places. Wyatt nodded. I could help with those. In exchange, he glanced around the cabin. I noticed you've got quite a garden plot out there, or what could be one. My own attempts at growing vegetables have been disastrous. Maybe you could advise me, perhaps spare some seedlings when you plant. It was a transparent attempt to maintain her dignity while offering assistance, but Mabel appreciated it nonetheless. That seems a fair trade, she agreed, ignoring the voice in her head that questioned the wisdom of allowing a near stranger such access to her home and life. As Wyatt prepared to leave, he paused at the door. I could come by tomorrow after my morning chores, start on that barn roof if that suits you. That would be fine, Mabel said, suddenly feeling shy. I'll have dinner ready when you finish. Wyatt tipped his hat. Until tomorrow then, Mabel. As she watched him drive away, Mabel felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. It was a dangerous feeling, she knew, but she couldn't help the small smile that lingered on her lips as she went back inside to mend her torn dress. True to his word, Wyatt arrived at Mabel's homestead the following day just after noon, his wagon loaded with lumber, tools, and a roll of tar paper. He worked steadily on the barn roof throughout the afternoon, his rhythmic hammering a strangely comforting soundtrack as Mabel tended to her neglected garden. The pattern continued in the days that followed. Wyatt would arrive, work on whatever repair was most pressing, and stay for the meal Mabel prepared. Their conversations grew longer, more personal. Mabel learned about Wyatt's childhood in Montana, raised by a father who taught him ranching, and a mother who instilled in him a respect for education. Wyatt discovered Mabel's love of books, her dream of one day teaching school, and her fierce attachment to the land her parents had worked so hard to claim. A week into their arrangement, Mabel was kneeling in the newly cleared garden plot, hands deep in the soil as she prepared it for planting when a shadow fell across her work. You've made progress, Wyatt observed, looking at the neat rows she'd created. Mabel sat back on her heels, wiping her brow with the back of her hand. As of you, the barn hasn't leaked once, despite that downpour yesterday. Wyatt offered his hand to help her up, and Mabel took it without hesitation, noticing how natural the gesture had become between them. I've been thinking, he said as she brushed dirt from her skirt. That irrigation ditch is going to take more than just my labor to fix properly. We'll need to shore up the sides with stone to prevent future collapse. I can't afford to hire help, Mabel said, her earlier good mood dimming. No need. I've got two hands, and you've got two as well, Wyatt replied simply. Between us, we can manage. Mabel stared at him. You want me to help with the ditch? Unless you're opposed to getting your hands dirty, Wyatt said, a teasing glint in his eye as he nodded toward her soil-covered fingers. Hardly, Mabel laughed, but it's back-breaking work. All the more reason to share the burden. Wyatt's expression grew more serious. Mabel, I know you're determined to maintain your independence, and I respect that, but there's no shame in accepting help when it's offered in good faith. There was something in his gaze, a warmth, an understanding that made Mabel's heart beat a little faster. All right, she agreed, we'll work on it together. And so they did. Over the next few weeks, they established a routine. Wyatt would arrive early, they would work side by side on whatever project needed attention, and then share a meal as the sun set. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they sat in comfortable silence, but always there was a growing sense of connection between them. Word of their arrangement inevitably reached the town. One Sunday, as Mabel and Wyatt sat in their now customary spot in the back pew of the church, she could feel the speculative glances cast their way. "They're talking about us," she whispered as Reverend Miller prepared to begin his sermon. "Let them," Wyatt replied, his voice equally low. Nothing improper in neighbors helping neighbors. But they both knew it had become more than that. The question was who would be brave enough to acknowledge it first. The answer came on a warm evening in late May. They had spent the day working on the irrigation ditch and now sat on Mabel's porch, watching the sun sink below the distant mountains. Mabel had changed from her work clothes into a simple dress, not her church dress, which was now properly mended, but a comfortable everyday garment that had seen better days but was clean and serviceable. "You know," Wyatt said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence, "I first noticed you months ago, long before that Sunday in church." Mabel turned to him in surprise. "You did?" Wyatt nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "You were at Miller's General Store, arguing with him about the price he was charging you for feed. Said it was higher than what he charged the men." A flush crept up Mabel's neck. "I remember that day. He finally agreed to the fair price, but only after I threatened to take my business to Junction City." "You were magnificent," Wyatt said, a smile playing at his lips. "Standing there with your chin up, not backing down an inch. I thought to myself, there's a woman who knows her own mind." "And yet, you never spoke to me until that day in church," Mabel observed. Wyatt's expression grew more serious. "I'm not good with words, Mabel, never have been, and you seemed apart from everyone. Like you didn't need anyone else." "I didn't want to need anyone," Mabel admitted softly. "After my father died, I was determined to prove I could manage on my own." "And you can," Wyatt assured her. "But the thing is, Mabel—" He hesitated, seeming to struggle with how to continue. "The thing is, there's a difference between needing someone because you can't survive without them, and wanting someone because life is better with them in it." The implication of his words hung in the air between them. Mabel's heart hammered in her chest as she gathered her courage. "And which am I to you, Wyatt Walker? A need or a want?" Wyatt turned to face her fully, his eyes reflecting the last golden rays of sunlight. "Neither," he said, his voice low and certain. "You're both, and more." Without another word, he leaned forward and placed his lips gently against hers. The kiss was brief, questioning, giving her every opportunity to pull away. But Mabel didn't pull away. Instead, she raised her hand to his cheek, feeling the rough stubble beneath her palm, as she returned the kiss with a certainty that surprised even herself. When they finally parted, Wyatt's eyes searched hers, as if looking for regret or hesitation. Finding none, he smiled a full, unguarded smile that transformed his usually stoic features. "I should go," he said, though he made no move to rise from the porch step where they sat. "It's getting late." "Yes, you should," Mabel agreed, equally motionless. Then, gathering her courage once more, she added, "Or you could stay for supper. I made apple pie." "Well," Wyatt said, his smile widening, "I've never been one to turn down pie." As they moved into the cabin, the air between them charged with new awareness, Mabel knew that whatever happened next, her life had irrevocably changed from the moment Wyatt Walker had stood beside her in that church and said, "Then we'll sit in back together." The summer unfolded in a series of shared moments working side by side in the fields, evenings on the porch watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk, Sunday services where they still sat in the back pew, but now with fingers occasionally entwined. The gossips of Palisade had plenty to talk about, but Mabel found she cared less with each passing day. By July, Mabel's homestead had undergone a remarkable transformation. The barn stood solid, its roof no longer leaking. The fields were green with growing crops, nourished by the repaired irrigation system. The cabin itself had been patched and painted, its windows now gleaming in the summer sun. But the most significant change was in Mabel herself. The weight of solitary struggle had lifted from her shoulders, replaced by a quiet confidence that came from knowing she was no longer alone. It wasn't that Wyatt had solved all her problems. Rather, they faced them together, as partners. When a late frost threatened her early plantings, it was Mabel who devised the solution of covering them with old sheets. When Wyatt's prize bull broke through a fence and wandered onto a neighbor's property, It was Mabel who smoothed things over with diplomatic skill. They complemented each other in ways neither had anticipated. Wyatt's practical nature balanced Mabel's occasional flights of fancy. Her warmth and openness helped ease the reserve that had kept him isolated for so long. One particularly hot afternoon in late July, they sat in the shade of an old oak tree, sharing a jug of cool water after spending the morning harvesting early vegetables. "I'm thinking of expanding the vegetable plot next year," Mabel said, leaning back against the tree trunk. "Maybe adding some fruit trees along the western border." Wyatt took a long drink before responding. "That's good thinking, though you might want to consider your labor needs if you expand much more. It's already a lot for one person to manage." "True," Mabel agreed, wiping sweat from her brow. "But I was thinking—" When she didn't continue, Wyatt looked at her questioningly. "Yes?" Mabel hesitated, suddenly unsure how to express the thought that had been forming in her mind for weeks now. "I was thinking that perhaps by next planting season, I might not be managing alone." The implication hung in the air between them. Wyatt set down the water jug, his expression serious as he turned to face her fully. "Mabel, are you saying what I think you're saying?" Heart pounding, Mabel met his gaze steadily. "I suppose that depends on what you think I'm saying, Wyatt Walker." A slow smile spread across his face. "I think you're saying that you might be amenable to a more permanent arrangement between us." "I might be," Mabel replied, her own lips curving upward, "if such an arrangement were proposed in the proper manner." Wyatt's smile widened as he reached for her hand, his calloused fingers entwining with hers. "Mabel Lockhart, would you do me the honor of—" A distant shout interrupted his words. They both turned to see a rider approaching at speed, dust billowing behind him. "That's young Tim from the telegraph office," Wyatt said, rising quickly to his feet and helping Mabel up. "Something must be wrong." The boy reined his horse to a stop before them, his face flushed with exertion. "Miss Lockhart, Mr. Walker, there's a fire in town. The church and half of Main Street are ablaze. Reverend Miller's calling for all able-bodied folk to help form a bucket brigade." Mabel and Wyatt exchanged a swift glance. "We'll hitch up the wagon right away," Wyatt told the boy. "Ride on and spread the word to the Hendersons down the road." As Tim galloped away, Mabel was already hurrying toward the barn, Wyatt close behind her. Within minutes, they had hitched Wyatt's team to the wagon and were racing toward town, the proposal momentarily forgotten in the face of crisis. The scene that greeted them in Palisade was one of chaos and destruction. Flames engulfed the church steeple, black smoke billowing into the clear blue sky. The fire had spread to the general store and the milliner's shop, with townspeople working desperately to prevent it from reaching the saloon, where the barrels of whiskey would turn a bad situation into a catastrophe. Wyatt pulled the wagon to a halt at the edge of town. "Stay here," he told Mabel, preparing to jump down. "I will not," she retorted, already gathering her skirts to descend. "They need every hand they can get." There was no time to argue. Together, they joined the bucket brigade that stretched from the town well to the burning buildings. For hours, they passed buckets of water hand to hand, their arms aching, throats burning from the smoke, but never stopping. Mabel found herself working alongside Harriet Pembroke, the woman's fine dress now as soiled and sodden as Mabel's own. Their eyes met briefly as they passed a bucket between them, a moment of understanding passing between two women united by common purpose despite their differences. As dusk fell, the fire was finally brought under control. The church was a complete loss, as were 3 businesses on Main Street, but the rest of the town had been saved. Exhausted, soot-covered townspeople gathered in the street, taking stock of the damage and their own minor injuries. Reverend Miller, his face streaked with ash, his clerical collar gray with soot, stood on an overturned barrel to address the crowd. "Friends, we have suffered a grievous loss today. Our church, the very heart of our community, is gone." Murmurs of dismay rippled through the gathering. "But," he continued, raising his hands for silence, "the church is not the building, it is the people. And today I saw the true spirit of Christian charity in action as every one of you, man and woman, rich and poor, longtime resident and newcomer alike, worked together to save our town." A chorus of agreement rose from the crowd. Mabel, standing beside Wyatt at the edge of the gathering, felt his arm slip around her waist, supporting her as fatigue threatened to buckle her knees. "We will rebuild," the Reverend declared. "Starting tomorrow, we will begin clearing the debris, and on Sunday, we will hold our service in the open air, under God's own roof, to give thanks that no lives were lost in this tragedy." As the crowd began to disperse, Wyatt guided Mabel toward their wagon. "You're dead on your feet," he observed, concern evident in his voice. "Let me take you home." "No," Mabel said, surprising herself with the firmness of her tone. "Not yet." She turned to face him, her smoke-reddened eyes serious. "You were about to ask me something important when we were interrupted." Wyatt's expression softened, a smile breaking through the layer of soot on his face. "You want me to propose marriage while we're both covered in ash and smelling of smoke?" "I can't think of a better time," Mabel replied. "Today reminded me that life is unpredictable and precious. I don't want to waste another day." For a moment, Wyatt simply looked at her, wonder and love mingling in his gaze. Then, heedless of the few townspeople still milling about, he dropped to one knee in the dirt of Main Street, taking her blackened hands in his. "Mabel Lockhart," he said, his voice strong and sure despite the day's exertions, "I have loved you since the moment I saw you stand your ground in Miller's store. I love your courage, your determination, your kindness. Will you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Tears cut clean tracks through the soot on Mabel's cheeks. "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you, Wyatt Walker." As he rose to seal the promise with a kiss, a small burst of applause erupted from the few witnesses to their engagement, including, to Mabel's surprise, Harriet Pembroke, whose grudging nods seemed to acknowledge that perhaps she had misjudged the woman in the torn dress all those months ago. The wedding took place 2 months later, on a perfect September day, when the aspens were turning gold against the blue Colorado sky. True to his word, Reverend Miller had organized the rebuilding of the church, though it was far from complete. Instead, the ceremony was held outdoors, in the meadow behind what was now to be Mabel and Wyatt's shared homestead. The entire town turned out for the occasion, partly from genuine goodwill and partly from curiosity. The fire had done more than destroy buildings. It had broken down some of the invisible barriers that had separated the townspeople. Working side by side in the bucket brigade, sleeping in neighbors' homes when their own were damaged, sharing food and resources in the aftermath, all had fostered a new sense of community. Mabel wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered to fit her slighter frame. As she walked toward Wyatt, who stood beneath an arch of autumn wildflowers, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment, from the despair of her father's death, to the humiliation of that torn dress in church, to the unexpected kindness of a quiet cowboy who had seen her worth when others saw only her circumstances. It had been a path of both hardship and unexpected joy. Wyatt's face as she approached was a study in barely contained emotion. His customary reserve had melted away, replaced by an open adoration that made Mabel's heart swell. When she reached him and placed her hands in his, the rightness of their union seemed as clear and evident as the mountains on the horizon. Reverend Miller's words washed over them as they exchanged their vows, promising to love, honor, and cherish one another for all the days of their lives. When Wyatt slipped a simple gold band onto Mabel's finger, a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, he had told her it felt like the completion of a circle that had begun that Sunday in church. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the Reverend declared. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." As Wyatt drew her into their first kiss as a married couple, the assembled townspeople broke into applause. Mabel was dimly aware of Harriet Pembroke dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, and of old Mr. Henderson removing his hat in respect. The celebration that followed was joyous and unconstrained. Tables laden with food stretched across the meadow, contributed by every family in Palisade. Fiddle music filled the air as couples danced on the grass. Children darted between the adults, playing tag in the lengthening shadows. As twilight descended, Mabel and Wyatt found a moment of quiet together, standing at the edge of the festivities and looking out over the land that was now their shared responsibility and joy. "Mrs. Walker," Wyatt said, testing the sound of her new name, "how does it feel?" "Wonderful," Mabel replied, leaning into his side. "Though I must say, it's taking some getting used to. Just this morning, Mrs. Henderson called me Mrs. Walker, and I looked around to see who she was addressing. Wyatt's laugh was low and warm. You'll adjust." "We both will." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "I was thinking about that irrigation project we started. If we extend it to the North Field next spring, we could—" "Wyatt Walker," Mabel interrupted, turning to face him with mock severity. "Are you discussing farm improvements on our wedding day?" "I suppose I am," he admitted with a sheepish smile. "Old habits." "Well, I forgive you," Mabel said, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. "Because I was just thinking that the old apple trees in the south orchard could use pruning before winter sets in." Their shared laughter blended with the music and merriment of their wedding celebration, a promise of the partnership that would define their life together. The first year of marriage brought both joys and challenges. Winter descended on Palisade with unusual ferocity, testing the repairs they had made to the homestead. A blizzard in January left them snowbound for nearly a week. Their world narrowed to the warm interior of the cabin and each other's company. Spring arrived late but glorious, the land reawakening with a vigor that matched their own enthusiasm for the future. They planted expanded fields, added a new corral for Wyatt's growing herd of cattle, and began construction on an addition to the cabin, a room that might one day serve as a nursery, though neither spoke this hope aloud. Summer saw their hard work rewarded with abundant crops and healthy livestock. They began to sell their excess produce in town, establishing a reputation for quality that brought customers even from neighboring communities. And through it all, their bond deepened. The tentative partnership that had begun with a torn dress and an act of kindness had grown into a marriage of true equals, each supporting the other's strengths and compensating for weaknesses. In October, just after their first anniversary, Mabel confirmed what she had suspected for several weeks. They were expecting a child. Wyatt's reaction to the news was everything she could have hoped for: joy, mingled with awe and a touch of apprehension that mirrored her own feelings. "A baby," he said, his hand gentle on her still flat stomach. "Our baby." The months that followed were a time of preparation and anticipation. Wyatt worked with renewed energy, completing the addition to the cabin and building a cradle from pine harvested from their own land. Mabel sewed tiny garments in the evenings, her fingers busy with needle and thread, as Wyatt read aloud from one of their precious books. Their child, a daughter they named Hope, was born on a mild spring day in May, 2 years after that fateful Sunday when Wyatt had first sat beside Mabel in the back pew of the church. The birth was long and difficult, with the town's midwife clucking in concern as hours stretched into a day. But Mabel's determination, coupled with Wyatt's steady presence, saw her through. When at last the newborn's cry filled the cabin, Wyatt's composure finally broke. Tears streamed unchecked down his face as he held his daughter for the first time, his large hands cradling her tiny form with infinite care. "She's perfect," he whispered, placing Hope in Mabel's arms. "Just like her mother." Life adjusted to accommodate their new addition. Wyatt took on more of the household duties as Mabel recovered from the birth and focused on caring for Hope. They developed new rhythms and routines, learning together the art of parenthood as they had learned the art of partnership. The town of Palisade continued to evolve as well. The new church, finally completed, stood prouder and sturdier than its predecessor. Main Street had been rebuilt, with brick replacing wood in many of the structures, a precaution against future fires. And the social fabric of the community had been rewoven, with old prejudices gradually giving way to a more inclusive spirit. On a Sunday morning, 5 years after they had first met, Mabel and Wyatt Walker entered the church with their daughter between them, her small hand clasped in each of theirs. They took their customary seats in the back pew, a choice now made from preference rather than necessity. As Reverend Miller delivered his sermon on the theme of transformation, Mabel's gaze drifted to the stained glass window that had been installed during the rebuilding. It depicted a phoenix rising from ashes, a symbol of the town's resilience after the fire. But to Mabel, it represented something more personal, the way life could emerge from adversity, stronger and more beautiful than before. She thought of the woman she had been that day in her torn dress, and the man who had seen beyond it to the person beneath. She thought of all they had built together in the years since, not just a successful homestead, but a life rich in love and purpose. Beside her, Wyatt seemed to sense her reflections. His hand found hers, fingers intertwining with the ease of long familiarity. On her other side, Hope leaned against her, the child's dark curls so like her father's spilling over Mabel's sleeve. In that moment, surrounded by her family in a community that had finally accepted them, Mabel felt a completeness she had once thought impossible. The journey had not been easy, but every step, even the painful ones, had led her here, to this perfect confluence of love and belonging. Later that afternoon, as they sat on the porch of their home, no longer just a homestead, but the heart of a thriving ranch, Mabel shared these thoughts with Wyatt. "Do you ever think about how different our lives might have been if you hadn't spoken to me that day?" she asked, watching Hope play with her wooden blocks in the yard. Wyatt considered the question. His arms settled comfortably around Mabel's shoulders. "I try not to dwell on might-have-beens," he said finally, "but I do thank God every day that I found the courage to say something." "As do I," Mabel agreed, leaning into his embrace. "Though I sometimes wonder what possessed you to take such a risk. You hardly knew me." "I knew enough," Wyatt replied, his voice holding the quiet certainty that had always been his hallmark. "I knew that a woman who would face down a church full of judgment with her head held high was someone special, someone worth knowing." Mabel smiled at the memory. "I was terrified," she admitted, "but too stubborn to show it." "That's my girl," Wyatt said with a chuckle. Then, more seriously, "That's what I fell in love with first, your courage. Everything else I learned about you after only confirmed what I already knew, that you were the one I'd been waiting for without even realizing I was waiting." The simple honesty of his words touched Mabel deeply, as they always did. For a man who claimed not to be good with words, Wyatt had an uncanny ability to express exactly what was in his heart when it mattered most. "Hope," she called to their daughter, "come tell Papa what you learned in Sunday school today." The little girl abandoned her blocks and ran to them, clambering onto Wyatt's lap with practiced ease. "We learned about loving your neighbor," she reported earnestly, "even if they're different from you." "That's an important lesson," Wyatt said, smoothing back a wayward curl from Hope's forehead. "One that some grown-ups take a long time to learn." "Like Mrs. Pembroke?" Hope asked innocently. Mabel stifled a laugh. "Mrs. Pembroke has come a long way, sweetheart. Remember how she brought you that doll when you were sick last winter?" Hope nodded, considering this evidence of redemption. "She said I was the prettiest little girl in Colorado territory." "And she was absolutely right," Wyatt agreed, giving his daughter a squeeze that elicited a delighted giggle. As the afternoon waned into evening, they moved inside for supper. The cabin, once so sparse and utilitarian, had become a true home. Books lined shelves that Wyatt had built, curtains that Mabel had sewn, framed windows that looked out on productive fields and healthy livestock. Hope's drawings were proudly displayed alongside family treasures. After their meal, as was their custom, they sat together while Wyatt read aloud. Tonight it was a chapter from Little Women, Hope's current favorite despite being somewhat advanced for her age. The child's eyes grew heavy as the story progressed, until finally she was asleep, her head pillowed on her father's chest. As Wyatt carried Hope to her bedroom, Mabel began clearing the table. Through the open window came the evening chorus of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle being settled for the night. Ordinary sounds of an ordinary life, yet to Mabel they represented everything she had once feared was beyond her reach. When Wyatt returned, he helped her with the dishes as he did every night, the domestic task completed in companionable efficiency. Then, as darkness fully claimed the land, they stepped outside once more to enjoy the cool evening air and the brilliant canopy of stars overhead. "I've been thinking," Wyatt said, as they settled on the porch swing he had built the previous summer. "Maybe it's time we hired some help around here. The ranch is doing well enough now to afford it, and with Hope starting school next year, you might want more time to pursue your own interests." Mabel looked at him in surprise. "My own interests?" "You used to talk about wanting to teach," Wyatt reminded her. "And I know you still love your books. Maybe with some help around here, you could find time for those things again." The thoughtfulness of the suggestion touched her deeply. "You wouldn't mind if I spent less time on the ranch?" "Mind? Mabel, I want you to be happy, not just content, but truly fulfilled." Wyatt's expression was earnest in the soft glow of the lamp from inside. "You've poured everything into making this place successful and raising our daughter. Maybe now it's time for you to remember the dreams you had before all that." Mabel considered his words, recognizing the truth in them. She did miss teaching, had always loved the few opportunities she'd had to share knowledge with eager minds. And while she cherished her life with Wyatt and Hope, there was a part of her that yearned for intellectual challenges beyond the practical problems of ranch management. "Perhaps you're right," she said slowly. "Reverend Miller did mention that they're still looking for someone to take over the school come fall. The last teacher moved back east to care for her mother. You'd be perfect for it," Wyatt encouraged. "And it would only be during the day. You'd still be here mornings and evenings. And all summer." The idea took root in Mabel's imagination, growing more appealing as she considered it. "I'll speak to the Reverend on Sunday," she decided. "See what the requirements might be." Wyatt's smile was all the approval she needed. "That's my Mabel, always ready for a new challenge." They sat in silence for a time, the swing moving gently beneath them, each lost in their own thoughts yet perfectly attuned to the other's presence. "Do you remember what I said to you that first day in church?" Wyatt asked eventually, his voice soft in the darkness. Mabel smiled, the memory as clear as if it had happened yesterday. "You said, 'Then we'll sit in back together.'" "And we've been sitting together ever since," Wyatt observed, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "Through everything, good times and hard ones." "I wouldn't have it any other way," Mabel replied, leaning up to place a kiss on his jaw. As the night deepened around their home, stars blazing in the vast Colorado sky, Mabel Lockhart Walker knew, with unshakable certainty, that the torn dress that had once been a symbol of her vulnerability had led her to her greatest strength. The love of a good man, the joy of their child, and the life they had built together from nothing but determination and faith in each other. It was, she reflected, a journey worth every step, every tear, every moment of doubt, for it had brought her here, to this perfect peace, this complete belonging, to a life where she no longer sat alone, but always, always together,